But anyway, welcome everyone to this IMC Tuesday talk. As some of you may know, this, as you can see, is the Interacting Mind Center, or what passes for the IMC during Corona times. But we have a long history of doing in talks where we invite interesting people to come present their work on stuff that has to do with the interaction between humans in kind of the broad space surrounding cognition and culture and social psychology and everything in between, which is basically what we research at the Interacting Mind Center at Aarhus University. And usually we'd be doing this together. We'd be gathered at Aarhus University, and we'd have sandwiches for everyone after. So I hope that you're okay with getting your own snacks, given the circumstances. And my name is Andreas Lieberoth. I'm sometimes they call me Little Andreas, which is weird because I'm almost a head taller than Andreas Ropstoff, but still, I'm the other Andreas at the Interacting Mind Center. He's our professor. And I promised to do the introductions today, partially because Andreas is away and partially because I know Benjamin was the one who suggested that he would come drop in. So I don't need to say too much about myself, except that I am a longtime IMC member myself and an associate professor at the Danish School of Education, where I work with digital technology, cyber psychology is what we call the field now, I think. And Benjamin is a friend of mine, I think now, but I got to know him because he called me out of the blue some time ago because he was doing his master's thesis in political science, and he was interested in the space around digital phone rules, and especially in the aftermath of France kind of creating a blanket ban on mobile phones in schools, which turns out not to be as hard as we first imagined. But a lot of Danish journalists and teachers were interested in, oh, should we do the same thing? What would happen if we banned mobile phones in Denmark? So I did a pretty large national survey to that effect some years ago to figure out what kind of rules were out there already and what were the teachers' perspectives and the school's perspectives on mobile phones in classrooms, on mobile phones during recess in general, and what kind of rules and regulations might make sense, kind of in this weird balance that we have between trying to create a school that creates digitally competent citizens in Denmark, and on the other hand, also doing classroom work in the usual way that you think. So how do phones disrupt classrooms? How do phones disrupt play, stuff like that? So we did a big survey on that, me and some of my students. And Benjamin called up when he was working at with the government and said, hey, I'm doing this master's thesis, and I'd really like to look at your data because I'm interested in kind of what effects this had, because what we were looking at was why do they do it? What are the reasons behind different rule sets, and kind of what do they feel that they get out of it? But he said, hey, why don't we see if they actually work, if we can kind of cross-tabulate this with some interesting data. And we discussed what might be possible, and I handed over my data, and he did a really, really interesting piece of work, which I know has been read already by a lot of interesting people as well. So this is kind of one of the culmination, not kind of the finish, I hope, for this work, but I invited Benjamin to come and to share his analysis and his thinking on this general space around mobile phones in schools, and especially kind of political rules for mobile phones. So this is who he is. Benjamin finished his master's thesis and did very well, and I'm happy to have continued the dialogue, and we're working on writing something together, I hope, in the near future. So this is, on one hand, a good chance to listen to some really, really interesting findings, I think, and also to help Benjamin and me figure out what are the interesting things that we should be doing now, and what are the questions that we should be answering when we write something about this at some point. So thank you all for showing up and showing an interest, and I will pass the microphone with no button click, but I'll just turn off my own to you, Benjamin. So thank you for being here, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind words. And can everybody see my my shared screen here?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. All right. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Benjamin Ilsøe, and I recently graduated from Department of Sociology at University of Copenhagen. Even though, yeah, sometimes it can it overlaps. And today I have the honor to present my thesis, Happy and Skillful Students is a Phone Ban the Way. The agenda is as followed. First, I will present my research question and how it was motivated. Secondly, I will present the applied theory and some research literature on the subject. Thirdly, I will present my data operationalization, final sample, and my research design. Then I will present the method applied to crunch the numbers, so to say. Then we get to the fun part, the tables of joy, aka the results. And after the results, I will argue whether or not these results are valid. Based on this, I will conclude and highlight some limitations. Then I will give you my perspective on the contribution of my thesis in a yet novel field of research. And finally, I will present two future research projects, which you are very welcome to finance. And yeah, so first of all, this question, the research question goes as follows. What are the correlations between various cell phone policies and students' well-being and academic performance in Danish primary and lower secondary public schools? And first of all, this question is motivated by the debate about what role digital devices and platforms should play in the lives of children and adolescents. This debate is largely driven by sentiments and political agendas rather than evidence, and maybe for a good reason. Only one previous study has examined how phone policies affect students academically in primary and lower secondary schools. Though there is some research on how phone use and present affect children and adolescents, both socially and academically, it is yet scarce, highly ambiguous, and thus also inconclusive. Secondly, the social lives of children and adolescents have largely shifted into virtual social spheres as owning smartphones became the standard. This development is termed the mobile youth culture. Parallel to this development, 60% of Danish primary and lower secondary schools have implemented total ban policies and thus cut off many students from the opportunity to interact with their social network. Since we know that happy children learn better, it must be in the interest of schools to implement phone policies that also support students' mental and social well-being. Furthermore, it must also be in the interest of schools to properly educate students on how to use the phone's many features and applications for study and work matters, and thus prepare them for an increasingly digitalized future. So that is like my overall motivation. And now I will go to the next slide. Yeah. So the theory, the theoretical framework is centered around Pierre Bourdieu's concept of field, doxa, habitus, and forms of capital. He's one of the old school guys in sociology, the father of structuralism. And then I have some more contemporary theory by Lee Rainey and Barry Wellman for 2012, who has a theory on the networked individual, which is the idea is that it's a new social operating system in a digital and mobile world. And together, these two theories are applied to frame how the school, in addition to being an institution of education, also is a social space in which digital devices and platforms play an increasingly prominent role. So Bourdieu's concept can be used to explain how students fight for an advantageous position in the social field of the school, whereas Bourdieu, the father of structuralism, has a very rigid structural view on social systems. Rain and Wellman, on the other hand, emphasizes how individuals have agency and how it is enabled as the world becomes increasingly digitalized. Here it's important to note that individuals need the skill to navigate in the realms of digitality, also known as technological capital. Rain and Wellman discuss that not every individual is a networked individual, but especially younger generations from the Western world are characterized as such, which describes the individuals in my sample, students in public schools. Rain and Wellman theory adds an interesting contemporary dimension to Bourdieu's concepts, as the individual is set free from the rigid power dynamics and social norms of the school social field. The theory indicates that students' social capital have become less dependent on successful social interactions in the offline social space. Instead, hereunder especially socially vulnerable students can locate like-minded peers online, interact, gain recognition, and thus compensate for a lack of offline relations. This is not only an effective strategy, it is also a legitimate one in 2021. By synergizing these theories, I argue that social capital acquired online potentially can be transformed into symbolic capital, such as prestige and reputation, which legitimizes the student's presence in the social field of the school. This could strengthen the student's positioning in the field and result in an accumulation of offline social capital. Furthermore, Rain and Wellman even challenges the notion of a division of an online and offline social sphere and describe how the spheres has fused into one complex and meshed reality. Assuming this, a transformation of social capital into symbolic capital and back becomes superfluous. The theoretical discussion on what a social sphere is not important for my thesis. The main takeaway is simply that the theory on networked individualism indicate that students are enabled more ways of accumulating social capital through the access to digital devices and platforms. As social capital is known to correlate with well-being, meaning the more social capital you have, the better you thrive mentally and socially. It could be beneficial for students if schools allowed them to engage in social online networks in school. All right. Yeah. In addition to the applied theory on social capital and social networks, I supplement with a wide range of research literature, so to speak, on how phone use and presence affect children and adolescents mentally, socially, and academically in various contexts. I only found one formal study on how phone policies affect student academic performance in primary and lower secondary school. And this is an English longitudinal causality study with a large sample that finds that restricting phone policies actually affect students' academic performance positively, though the effect is primarily driven by low-performing students. But the study has some cons. The study only sampled from 4 big cities. Of course, problem with an external validity does not really represent England in general. The study does not control for well-being, absence in schools, nor socioeconomic status or sociocultural status. And these are all very important confounding variables. And the study also has a very rigid operationalization of phone policies. Either there is a total ban policy or there are no policy at all. So it's kind of like a chaotic. And this does not really reflect reality at all, as a big mapping study from Andreas from Interactive Mind Center's own Andreas Lieberoth has found. Yeah. Finally, as the English society is characterized with a much higher level of social stratification than the Danish society, the findings most likely won't apply to a Danish context. And this is something I will discuss later. Yeah, so therefore I broadened the scope and included studies on how phone use and presence affect well-being and academic performance in school, and found a decent amount of research on how phone affect academic performance. Yet the findings are still very ambiguous. But I did not find much research on how phone affects well-being. Therefore, I broadened the scope even more and also included studies on how phones affect well-being in general, so not only in a specific school context. Some of these studies also includes adults as cohorts. So now it's not only findings related to students or to children. Some of these studies, and the end result was 5 identified mechanisms that affect the students' well-being and academic performance. And those are the ones listed in the table you can see in the bottom here. The first one, learning inhibiting. The strand of research finds that phones are disruptive to the teaching context and inhibit learning. And what this strand of theory or findings imply is that that the mechanism has a negative effect on students' academic performance. This mechanism is also expected to have a spatial effect, meaning that the student using a phone in a teaching context not only inhibits his or her learning, but also other students' learning. So that's also quite interesting dimension. The second part, the second strand finds that phones promote learning through a teacher-led didactic strategy in the teaching context. Furthermore, phones strengthen the collaborative learning in and out of teaching context. So for instance, the students can, when they get back from school, they can help each other with the homework online and stuff. And this mechanism has been found to have a positive effect on students' academic performance, though the overall research on this is kind of very, very ambiguous. All right, yeah, and the third mechanism I found is digital communication, the online network and social capital. And this strand finds that phones enable digital communication and thus contact to maintenance of and expansion of social networks. This results, among other things, in an accumulation of social capital. And this is very similar to the theoretical argument by Rain and Wellman that I just went through on the last slide. And this mechanism has a positive effect on students' well-being. This mechanism is predominantly assumed to apply to an outside of the teaching context, so in the recess or field trips and so forth. But it is plausible that phone policies that enable in-class use also enable this form of mechanism, meaning that by having access to the phone in a teaching context, the phone may be used to engage with social networks. Here the mechanism presumably overlaps with the mechanism A, the learning inhibiting, and becomes, and perhaps at the same time also have a positive effect on well-being. So while the students can accumulate more social capital and have a positive effect on well-being, it might also be disruptive for their academic performance in form of learning inhibiting. The fourth mechanism is the online risk and psychosocial issues. And this strand finds the social media platforms expose children and adolescents to risks such as bullying, grooming, fraud, and so forth. And this mechanism also has a negative effect on students' well-being. This is just, I would say, also very weak research literature, and it's definitely driven by some specific cohorts in the samples. The fifth and final strand is sedentarism and screen time. And this strand finds that phones have an impact on the degree of sedentary behavior and screen time, which is associated with a wide range of health indicators in a negative way, for instance, physical activity. This mechanism has a negative effect on both students' well-being and academic performance. This mechanism only applies outside the teaching context, of course, as students already are sedentary, meaning sitting still in the teaching context. In other words, the phones are not the cause for sedentary behavior in the teaching context. The teaching context is the cause. The mechanism is also expected to have a spatial effect as students in the vicinity of the user to a lesser extent have someone to be physically active with. As a result, students in the vicinity of the user are likely to be less physically active. But even this strand of research, you could also challenge. Overall, the findings in the research literature on mechanism A, the learning inhibiting, and mechanism C, the online network and social capital, is most compelling. And that is largely in numbers, actually, quantitative, but also qualitative. There is more substantial, stronger, significant effects, but also, yeah, there are many more studies on these subjects, which also kind of makes it easier to make a conclusion. As I will present in the following slides, the semi-restrictive phone policy disables this mechanism A, the learning inhibiting, while it enables the mechanism C, the online network and social capital. This means that students won't experience a negative effect on academic performance, while they will experience a positive effect on well-being, theoretically. All right. Now to some of the more fun part here, and that is the first data set, which is the phone policy data from the Screen No Screen report from 2018 by Andreas Liebowitz. And what this report, the mapping found, was that the phone policies vary in a very, very large degree. It consists of 602 private and public primary, lower, and secondary schools who were interviewed by phone. And their phone policies range from very restrictive to very liberal phone policies and everything in between, while some schools didn't even have phone policies. Some of these policies apply for the whole school, some only apply for some grades, and some schools even let the teachers assess what phone policy to implement for each class. And in order to be able to argue that all students from an included school were exposed to the same phone stimuli, so to speak, they had to be subjected to the same phone policy. Thus, I only had an interest in investigating schools that had a policy that applied for the whole school. So that's very important. Otherwise, it would challenge the internal validity of results to a big degree. And this is like kind of how the main idea is for the operationalization of the phone policies. The restrictive phone policy you see in the top left here is defined by neither allowing use in or out of the teaching context. And that's a combination of 3 policies: a definite ban where they're not allowed to bring it to school at all, a confiscation upon arrival, which is dubbed as a phone prison in the mapping by Andreas, and the storage in the bag policy, where the students can have a more active role than just putting it away in class. And this you can also question how effective that actually is. Then there is the liberal phone policy, which is defined by allowing both use in and out of the teaching context. And that is a combination of a teacher-led use in the teaching context, so like a didactic strategy overall for the school, and the no phone policies at all. And that is, of course, a very big qualitative difference in those 2 phone policies. Though they are same degree of exposure, there are definitely a difference in how the phones are used functionally. And obviously, this is something you could discuss as a problematic aggregation. Thirdly, you have the semi-restrictive phone policy, which is defined by only allowing use out of teaching context. So that is only in recess and field trips. And these are combined with like a classroom storage and handout in recess kind of phone policy, which is dubbed the phone hotel in the mapping by Andreas, along with the storage in the bag policy. And these investigative phone policies enable different degrees of exposure and functional applications of the phone in and out of the teaching context. And that's kind of the whole idea of this. But in order to kind of be able to use these phone policies as a measure, there are 2 assumptions that kind of have to be filled out. And first of all, it is assumed that the more the students have access to phones, the more the phones will be used on average. That's very important. So assuming in a liberal phone policy, the students will use phones more than they will in a restricted, and of course they will in a restricted phone policy. So that's a very important assumption. Secondly, it is assumed that the phone's functional application is different in the teaching context from out of the teaching context. In the teaching context, the phone is predominantly used as a didactic tool, so to speak. So you use it in like teaching children math, maybe as a calculator or to search for information and whatnot. And out of the teaching context, the phone is predominantly used for social purposes. And that's also very plausible that they probably won't do homework in the recess. They will check up on how their friends are doing on Facebook. So to recap, the liberal phone policy allows students to be stimulated by both the phone's didactic and social functional application. And the semi-restrictive phone policy, this one, allows students to be stimulated only by the phone's social functional application, while the restrictive phone policy, this one, allows no stimuli at all in theory. And this form of operationalization allows me to isolate the social effects of the phone in a school context. And this is a new contribution to the field of research. So this is why I will investigate this semi-restrictive phone policy as like my main variable of interest. This is a variable, but this will be dummified, as I will get to later. Yeah. All right, and over here you can see like an overall DAG model, and it's kind of a very simple one. And this illustrates the presumed interactions. So to the left, you see the phone policy here. And I investigate 3 phone policies, as you saw on the last slide, that either allow or do not allow phones in and out of the teaching context. And these 2 different contexts allow 5 different mechanisms, also went through in a couple of slides ago, that affect well-being and academic performance. As you can see, I have added socio-economic status. That is a little round red circle here called SES, and age up here as moderating factors. As you can see, I've only linked these moderating factors to mechanism A, the learning inhibiting and to mechanism C, the online network. This is because I had to limit myself, and I didn't have enough pages or left to theoretical argue if and how much of these variables are moderated by variables such as socioeconomic status and age and so forth, but also gender, ethnicity, and so forth. So, for instance, it might be plausible that gender also has a moderating effect on some of these mechanisms. It might also be that the socioeconomic status has a moderating effect on more of these mechanisms, but I kind of have to limit myself also. So the overall idea is here, I want to look at all students, and I want to look at age as a moderating factor and socioeconomic status as a moderating factor. So they will be investigated both as an interactive term, but I will also show how it will look when you make a sample split and do a subgroup analysis. Yeah, so the second data part is here where it makes it possible for me to do the regression analysis so combining it with Andreas' big mapping of the phone policies, I can actually tell whether or not the phone policies correlate with these dependent variables such as well-being and academic performance. And these data sets are school-based registry data from the Danish Ministry of Children and Education from 2018 and social-demographic registry data from Statistics Denmark from 2018. And the academic performance, first of all, this is measured as a test score from the yearly national testing in Danish on a norm scale based from 1 to 100. And Danish reading is tested in 2nd and in 4th and 6th and 8th grade. So 4 different kind of categories or age groups, so to see. It is tested in 3 profile areas: language comprehension, decoding, and text comprehension, and is given an overall score. Usually this is a very good estimate for academic performance, but this can also be contested. Maybe you could use different kind of measurements for academic performance. But nonetheless, this gives me a big sample. Then I have subjective well-being. This is measured as a score called Factor 9 from the yearly National Student Well-being Assessment. And the Factor 9 score is a creation by the ministry. And they have conducted a rash analysis on students' well-being data ranging from 2014 to 19. And the ministry found that the answers to 9 questions out of 40 questions from the questionnaire systematically follow each other. And that's kind of interesting. So you kind of want to see, do we actually measure well-being? And when you did an analysis in this big questionnaire, you found that 9 answers. Yeah, well, they kind of, when you answer this, you also answer this and this and this. So now that is kind of the main indicator for well-being used in the ministry, and it's also the most precise overall indicator from the national assessment. And this is the same measurement I've chosen to use for that reason primarily. It's very important to note to underscore that this questionnaire is only from the 4th to 9th grade. So actually, I won't be able to investigate 0th to 3rd grade because they answer a different questionnaire. There will be difficulties with the comparability, and that is just kind of how it is. There's nothing I can do about that. Oh well. The third variable I include is control variable is the school absence, and this is measured as a student's total absence in school in percent. And school absence is very different from subjective well-being. Students can have low absence and yet not thrive, and vice versa, though the latter is probably much more unlikely. So the absence is kind of a good proxy for how much a student is exposed to the school's social and academic stimuli. So if they're not there, they're not going to get so much stimuli from the phone in the school, of course, and the other way around. Then I also of course, I include gender, and I'm not going to go through that one as a control variable. Then I have ethnicity, and this is a simple dummy variable with 3 categories. So either Danish origin, 1st generation immigrant, or 2nd generation immigrant. Then I have the social, economic, and cultural status. This is measured as parents' longest completed educational level, ranging from elementary school to PhD. And I have recoded this variable into an ordinal variable, where elementary school is given the number 1 and PhD is given the number 7. I did not have the information to code as X years of education, yet I would also argue that the ordering of education level is a better measurement when controlling for well-being and academic performance. For instance, though vocational education and high school education often result in the same amount of years of education, it is likely that the parents with a high school education have a higher cultural capital and thus are more capable at assisting their children with homework and so forth. Therefore, I would argue that my coding is a legitimate numerical coding for how much cultural capital the students' parents have. At the same time, the coding also depicts economic capital to some degree, though this can also be contested. We all know that academics do not necessarily earn a lot, and people work as a carpenter, they own much more. Yeah, so this leads me to the sample. And after some data cleaning, I end up with a final sample consisting of primary and lower secondary public school students from 4th, 6th, and 8th grade. So here, no 2nd grade, even though they are tested in Danish reading. And these students are enrolled in a school with either a restrictive, semi-restrictive, or liberal phone policy. And they have all participated in the national testing in Danish and in the National Student Wellbeing Assessment in the school year 2018-2019. Yeah, and the result is 11,575 students nested in 108 schools, which ensures more than enough statistical power. This is a very big set. The reason why I exclude these 2nd graders is kind of like I already said, is because I would have challenges with comparability, simply because they answer a very different questionnaire. And the reason why I choose Danish as a measurement for academic performance instead of math is because math is only tested in 3rd, 6th, and 8th grade. And as 3rd graders also answer different questionnaires in the National Student Wellbeing Assessment, I would only be able to investigate 6th and 8th graders. And this would leave me with an even smaller sample, less statistical power, and also less variation of age, which I do not want to have as I investigate age as a moderating factor. Yeah. All right, so now I have presented the applied theory, the existing research literature, the data, my sample. I will go through my design. Since I do not know when the schools have implemented the phone policies, only that it was the current policy in 2018 when the schools were interviewed, I chose a cross-sectional association design. Therefore, I cannot comment on changes over time nor causality. I can only comment on a specific point in time and whether or not variables correlate. This also means that I cannot determine whether phone policies affect well-being and academic performance, or well-being and academic performance affect phone policies. For instance, it's very plausible that a school principal implement phone policies as a result of low-performing students. So his students are not doing very well in this yearly test, and and he reads an article about how phones are disruptive. So what he does is that he implements a phone policy, and as a result, as a response to his students' low performance. So to sum up, I can only comment on how phone policies, well-being, and academic performance correlate with one another. I cannot comment on if phone policies cause changes in well-being and academic performance, though that is what I hypothesize. And that is like illustrated here with this little picture here, where you can see that there is an arrow going both ways and not only one way. And that is just, that is an important takeaway. The method, Now we're almost at the results, but first I'm going to give you the very brief description of the multi-level modeling and why I have chosen this method. A multi-level model is a mixed effect model with a fixed and a random part. And it's going to be a little bit technical, but I'm going to try to get you go through it like rather brief and precise. The fixed part, as you can see up here, it entails the slopes of micro and macro level predictors. So that is the students and predictors at the school level and predictors at a student level, and the overall intercept, and that is this one. These are the non-varying point estimates, and thus they are called fixed. So that is like this when you have a simple regression. This is kind of the only thing the regression entails. Also, of course, they have a residual also, but yeah, the residual is different in the multi-level. The random part entails the leftover between school variation, so that is the U_0J here, and the leftover within school variation, the R_IJ. So you have an extra residual in a multi-level analysis or modeling. And these are assumed to be normally distributed random variables that are generated by unmeasured processes. So it's like all the latent variables, so to speak. They are leftover macro and micro level residuals. And as random variables, their concrete values therefore remain latent, and only the variances can be estimated. So this is why we even have the statistics, you know. Both the intercept and the slope can be random. The equation you see to the right only has a random intercept, and that is U_0J. This means that every school has their own intercept, which is the expected mean value of well-being and academic performance when all predictors are constant. The model becomes much more complex when you also include a random slope. And I will not go through this model, but I do actually include a random slope for socioeconomic status and age in some of my models. And that is because I test the cross-level interaction between these variables and phone policies. And if I did not add a random slope for the socioeconomic status and gender, and age, the models ignore the risk of autocorrelation, which can result in misleading parameter estimates. As you can see in this figure down here, you have like a simple linear regression. So that's like only with fixed effects. So you only have one line. And in a mixed effect model with a random intercept but a fixed slope, you have several lines, but they all have the same slope. And that is this model up here, the random intercept model. And that's like the most basic multi-level modeling. And once you start to also add random slopes to the model, it becomes very complex. And that is the model you have down here. So now the school's intercept not only can vary, also every predictor, every school's predictor variable. So for instance, age can vary for every school. And that is, it enables a lot of interesting tools, but it also makes a model very complex, and sometimes you can have difficulties even converging the models and basically crash the programs. But the computer power helps out with this problem, but still there are some limits to how complex you can make a model. So for instance, it would make sense to add a random slope for every variable that you have, but that's just simply not possible because of model convergence. All right, the method 2, so why choose multi-leveling model? As explained earlier, each student in my data set is nested into schools. It's like a Russian dolls are nested into one another. So you have like students nested into classes, nested into schools, municipalities, countries, and so forth. And this means that I know exactly which school each student attends, and enables to partition the residual variance into a between school component, which is the variance of the school level residuals, and a within school component, which is the variance of the student level residuals. And the school residuals, often called the school effects, represent unobserved school characteristics that affect student outcomes. It is these unobserved variables which lead to correlation between outcomes for students from the same school. Phone policy can be characterized as a school effect, but in this case, it is observable. I add the variable to the model. This is a predictor of interest, and it can actually only be investigated through multi-level modeling. So traditional multiple regression and techniques treat the units of analysis as independent observations. One consequence of failing to recognize hierarchical structures is that standard errors of regression coefficients will be underestimated, leading to an overstatement of statistical significance. Standard errors for the coefficients of school-level predictor variables, such as phone policies, will be most affected by ignoring grouping, as I will show on my next slide. This is the case when modeling my data with a multiple linear regression. In my sample, the students are not nested into classes, which again are nested into schools, since the data didn't provide the necessary information. And that is definitely something future studies should try to include. So you also can account and control for various class effects. So my students, so in my data, students are nested into schools, they're not nested into classes and thus nested into schools. So it's only a two-level data construction. Yeah, so this is the insufficient method, so to speak, the wrong model you see to the left. And here you see two multiple linear regression models that grossly underestimates the standard error. As you can see here, I've highlighted it with green. It means that there is actually a positive correlation. So when you use a simple model compared to a multi-level model, you actually find very, very strong evidence for positive correlation here. In fact, the standard errors are 2 to 3.5 times lower compared to the multi-level model, as you see to the right. So for instance, over here, you have a standard error, which is 28, 0.028. And over here, you have a standard error that is 0.101. And what you can see is that it leads to misleading results. It's for instance, now it is indicated with a simple model that restrictive phone policies correlate strongly and positively with students' well-being and academic performance. And first, when I did this simple analysis, I thought this can't be right. And then, of course, I applied the right method. And then, of course, all my assumptions were verified. And it's also very important to notice here how all the variables that usually so I'm sorry, by the way, that these models are in Danish, but it's just a little extra, how all these variables that usually correlate very strongly with academic performance and well-being, they correlate very strongly in both models. So it's not like this model is doing something else than doing something right, basically. Yeah, so this is like the overall some descriptive statistics, and it's actually just here to give an overview of the variables. I'm not going to go through it very much. So you see all the variables out here in the first column, and the second column is what level these variables are at. So some is only on a student level and some is on a school level. So for instance, the phone policy, that is something that is characterized, every school is characterized with a certain phone policy, and also every school has an average socioeconomic status, and that is just the mean of all students' socioeconomic status on every school, for each school. Some of these variables are also numerical and some are categorical, even though I have already recoded the socioeconomic status from categorical to numerical. But for instance, here you see that the phone policy is a dummy variable with 3 categories. So either semi-restrictive liberal, and it will have a 0, 1, or 2. And the gender is either male or female, so 0 and 1. And the ethnicity is either Danish origin, second generation, first generation, which is 0, 1, second. Yeah, and actually you can't really read much out of these numbers, the minimum to the max, the mean, and so forth, because I have set standardized all the variables so I can compare them. Yeah, so now we are at some of the fun part, which is the results. And this is like the first overall big table where you can see the models as I've built on. So the first model is a total empty model. This is where there is actually no variables at all except the outcome of well-being and academic performance. And this is usually used to calculate an interclass correlation coefficient, which is basically how much of the total variance in academic performance and well-being that is caused by school effects. And when I did this calculation, the interclass correlation coefficient, I actually found that I think it was around 7% of the variance in well-being academic performance is explained by school effects, and that is very low. Usually in American studies, it's around 20%, which is explained by school effects. But it's not weird if you think about it. You have a very strong public school system and so forth. So that's like the first of 2 models. The next 2 models is where I just test how it looks when I just add the restrictive the phone policies to the model. And here you can see there is no correlation at all. It's not a very interesting model, but it is a good way to kind of test that you don't kind of build a too complex model when you add all the control variables. Sometimes adding too many control variables that are not theoretical found, it can actually alter the correlation of the predictors of interest here, the variables of interest. But as you see here, it doesn't. So that is like the main model here, and that's the model 5 and the model 6. So here I have added all the variables. So I have the predictor, the predictor of interest, which is the phone policy here, and I have all the control variables down here. And as you can see, all the control variables, they correlate how they are supposed to correlate. There is nothing weird here. When you look into the parameter estimates, it's positive and negative where you expect them to be. And then when you look at the phone policy, again, there is no indication that there is any significance. And actually the t-values are pretty high. You cannot see it here in this model, but they are not even close. And they are not far away, but they are not close either to actually be significant with a 5% p-value. So this is like the most basic model, and this is the random intercept model. So here I haven't added any random slopes. This is just where I let every school's intercept vary. And the next slide is where I now expand this mixed effect model to also have a random slope. And I'd also investigate whether or not age, socioeconomic status, and now I have also a little extra Easter egg here, gender, also moderate the association between phone policies, well-being, and academic performance. So for instance, here in the first model is 7 and 8. Now you will no longer look at these parameter estimates up here. We are only interested in the ones down on the bottom, and I will mark them out with different colors so you can see what kind of control variable we are using as a moderating effect. And in the first two columns, the model 7 and 8, you will see that age, there is no correlation either here. And that is kind of interesting. So it doesn't mean, it means that being older or being younger doesn't have an impact on whether or not phone policies correlate with well-being and academic performance. You could, for instance, hypothesize that the older you are, the more you need your phone to engage in social online networks, when you're younger, you don't. But there is no evidence of that in this model. And the next two columns, the model 9 and model 10, I've done the same with socioeconomic status. So now this, I'm testing whether or not having parents, whether or not having a low socioeconomic status or high socioeconomic status moderates the correlation between phone policies and well-being and academic performance. And again, here I find no correlation at all. So whether or not you're socially vulnerable in school or you're very popular, it doesn't matter. The phone policies still don't really seem to have an effect on you. That is also very interesting finding. And the last two columns here, I've done the same with the gender as a moderating factor. And also here, I do not find any evidence. So it does not matter whether or not you're a girl or a boy, phone policies still do not affect you. And that is very interesting also. Yeah, so what I did here before, well, again here, is that I created something called interactive terms. But what you can also do is you can do a sample split and then do a subgroup analysis. And this is a little extra, so I have now translated it into English. And this, there's like some pros and some cons. The pros is that the model becomes more sensitive and can be used to detect potential unobservable confounding factors. And the cons is that the statistical power reduces as a sample reduces. So you can see, for instance, down here, you only have 5,000 observations. Here you have 5,500, 4,000, and so forth. So of course, as the sample size reduces, you have less statistical power. And of course, that also has a factor to play. But as you can see, once I divide up my sample here into different cohorts, so you have like low socioeconomic status and high socioeconomic status, or when you have only 4th graders and only 8th graders. In table 1, 2, it should supposed to be 2 here, 3. there's still no correlation at all. It's depicted with all the red numbers here. There are no correlation at all with phone policies and academic performance and well-being. But when you get to table 4, you see there is actually a small correlation here, marked with 1 star, between restrictive phone policies and academic performance. So that means that 8th graders who are subjected to a restrictive phone policy actually perform better academically than students subjected to a semi-restrictive phone policy. And it's important that it's compared to, because the dummy variable is a semi-restrictive, so it's always in comparison to something else. And that is kind of interesting. First of all, it doesn't really theoretically make any sense. Like I couldn't really understand why that would be. Instead, because they're both not subjected to the phone in class, so why no one will be disturbed by the phone, so to speak. So what I thought is that perhaps restrictive phone policy also is a proxy for something else, or maybe it mediates an effect, and that is where the multi-level tool becomes very handy. And fortunately, it can actually be investigated whether or not there is something latent, that mediates this effect, or is a proxy, or if it's a proxy. And that can be done through adding a random slope to the model. This I did. I added a random slope to this specific model with this specific cohort, which is the 8th graders. And what I found is that by allowing slope for gender, it's actually for gender and for allowing the slope for gender to vary from school to school, the weak significance disappears. As you see, there is no longer a significance. In other words, the strength of the association between gender and students' academic performance apparently vary across schools, which means that either male or female students perform better academically at some schools. And what can explain this? That is kind of interesting. My interpretation of this finding is that the correlation in the model with a statistical significant correlation that I showed in the previous slide, this one, is driven by unobserved contextual factors that moderate how gender affect academic performance. For example, it is plausible that a majority of schools with restrictive phone policies in my sample may have a more traditional didactic strategy, which research indicates favor female students. And by chance, many of these schools have 8th grades. Not all schools have all grades. It's important to clarify. Some only have the first grades and some only have the last grades. And it makes sense that schools with a more strict approach to the use of digital devices and platforms also prefer to enforce a more conservative and traditional didactic strategy. And as soon as I let the school slope for gender vary, so that means that how much the gender affect the academic performance and well-being, or actually correlate is not an effect. Then I kind of indirectly control for traditional didactic strategies, and the correlation disappears. And this is a perfect example of how powerful multi-leveling modeling actually is. So without actually knowing the variable, I can actually control for it with the use of the variables included in the model, of course. Yeah. All right. So I didn't find any correlation between the variables of interest, but is it valid to conclude anything based on these findings? And I argue yes. First of all, the data is of very high quality. Some is collected through phone interviews and published as a scientific research report. Other data is registry data collected by the Ministry and Statistics Denmark, which are both recognized professional institutions with data collection and processing experience. Secondly, my sample for students is large enough to follow a Z distribution for each of the 3 phone policies. Each phone policy is represented by more than 1,000 students. This ensures statistical power and certainty. Although my sample for schools is only 108, simulations show that regression coefficients, variance components, and standard errors do not become misleading when group level samples are more than 50. So as long as I had more than 50 schools in my sample, everything is fine. Thirdly, the models meet the criteria for model assumptions to a satisfactory degree. For instance, micro-level residuals meet the criteria for linearity and homoscedasticity. So the variables, the points, so to estimate, they kind of follow a linear curve. And furthermore, both the micro level and macro level residual are normally distributed, and only 2 schools could be considered outliers. I could have removed these schools from the data set, and I actually did try it and did not really change anything. Not at least not with the predictor of interest. Fourth, as shown in the last slide, I can account for unobserved school effects, such as traditional didactic strategies, by adding a random slope for gender to the model. This would not be possible with a multiple linear regression. So it's just kind of, again, just a very, very potent method. And finally, the data is highly representative for the Danish population, and I will show this in the next slide. Here you can see the representativeness of the data set, and I'm just going to go through this pretty fast, but I've kind of compared my data set with the Denmark statistics data. And what I find is that it's very, very almost one-to-one all the way down when it comes to how different the students are divided into different grades. Also, when it comes to gender, it's also very close. And the same with ethnicity, which is a very, very kind of big surprise to me, and only shows how strong this data set is and how representative it is. When it comes to socioeconomic status, it can be contested, though, if it is representative. But it's important to point out that the Denmark statistics data represent all adults from 35 to 44, with and without children. This is as close as I could get to in a grady way, based on the likelihood that this age range has they have children in this age range that attends either 4th, 6th, or 8th grade. It is very likely that people with children on average are more educated than people without children, especially when you investigate further. If you look, for instance, down here, you can see that almost 3 times as many people in Denmark statistic data have the longest educated, has completed the primary and lower secondary school as the longest education. And when you look at in the statistics data compared to the medium cycle higher education, so for instance, the nurses or teachers and so forth, I have around like 10% more in my data set that are characterized with this education. So what it indicates is that people are more educated, but it also makes sense when you have children that attend the school, you know. Therefore, I found it very plausible that my variable for socioeconomic status is representative. Yet, I have also decided to weigh the categories to test if this changes the outcome, and that is just a very basic way to kind of test that I don't bias the results by over and underestimating different categories in my socioeconomic status variable. And again, sorry for the Danish here, but as you can tell, phone policies, even when I weight socioeconomic statuses, it doesn't change. They still do not correlate with well-being and academic performance. And all the other variables, they're still acting exactly how you expect them to be. So again, it's evidence that my data is highly representative and therefore have a very strong external validity. Yeah, now we are getting close to the end here. This is basically the conclusion, is that there are no correlations between restrictive, semi-restrictive, or liberal phone policies and students' well-being and academic performance in Danish primary and lower secondary public schools. And this applies to students as a whole, but since I also modeled age and socioeconomic status and even gender, just to show you, as moderating factors, I can further conclude that the same conclusion applies to whether students are male or female, young or old, or socially advantaged or disadvantaged. In other words, there is no evidence that students subjected to a restrictive, semi-restrictive, or liberal phone policy thrive better or worse, nor perform better or worse academically. When it comes to the limitation, though, there are still a few limitations to my findings. First of all, I cannot comment on students who are subject to a phone policy based on teachers' discretion. I only investigate schools with phone policy that apply to every student. So when the whole school has the same phone policy, this perhaps customized phone policies for each class achieves the most optimal fit. For instance, it is possible that not every teaching context benefits from the integration of digital tools. Either students do not respond well to digital tools, or the teachers are not properly educated and thus not capable of integrating digital tools as a didactic strategy. So it would also be kind of interesting to look into those phone policies where it's up to the teacher's kind of assessment of the class whether or not they're capable of applying didactic tools. digital tools, sorry. But it's also, of course, difficult to know exactly what grade this is, and with the data set, I could not do that. Second, I cannot comment on students from 0th to 3rd grade, which is called indskoling in Danish. My sample only consists of 4th, 6th, and 8th grades due to comparison issues in the National Student Wellbeing Assessment. And it may be that young students' well-being and academic performance correlate with phone policies. I do not know. If, for example, the students have been subjected to a digital didactic strategy since the first day of school, they may be better digitally educated and thus achieve a better result from the stimuli of digital devices and platforms, both in and out of the teaching context. It is much more likely that a student from 2nd grade has been subjected to such a strategy since day 1 of school rather than an 8th grader, as we are not only now beginning to understand the importance of digital education and the integration of digital tools in school and in learning situations. Thirdly, I cannot generalize my findings to countries that have a notable different social model. Contrary to the English study that I mentioned in the introduction, in the motivation, I do not find evidence that indicate the phone policies affect academic performance. So it can, of course, be a matter of design and data, which it might be to some extent. This we can discuss, but I will argue that it's predominantly a matter of context. So studying Danish context rather than an English context just produces different findings. So this leads me to the contribution of my thesis and my findings. First of all, my findings may contribute to theory development on socioeconomic homogeneity. My results do not match the theoretical framework nor findings in the research literature. And this is very interesting. As I mentioned in the previous slide, my findings do not match those of the English study. But how come? Is it plausible that there are structural factors that alleviate these presumed effects of phone use and presence in school? The English and Danish society are very different, whereas the Danish society is characterized by socioeconomic homogeneity, low social stratification. The English society is characterized by socioeconomic heterogeneity and high social stratification. This means, among other things, the Danish students in average have a strong, solid social and academic foundation acquired through the primarily socialization in the family. Add to this how economic and educational resources also are evenly distributed in the Danish school system. This could possibly be the reason why Danish students on average are more resilient towards external factors than the average British student, and external factors could be, for instance, phone policies. This is not only theoretical reflections that I have kind of pondered on. According to the 2018 PISA survey, Denmark is doing very well when it comes to academic performance. Denmark is positioned significantly above the OECD average in reading. Furthermore, the variation in the students' performance is smaller compared to countries with higher social stratification, indicating that Denmark has fewer low-performing students than many other countries, but they also have fewer high-performing students. When it comes to well-being, Denmark is also doing very well. Last year, a comparative study by Unicef ranked children's well-being in Denmark number 2 out of 41 countries, and that is very impressive. In other words, country-level variables such as socioeconomic and sociocultural homogeneity can possibly explain why Danish students on average thrive socially and academically, are resilient, and are less affected by school effects such as phone policies. Maybe Danish students on average are not affected negatively by the phone's disruptive functions because they and their family possess the capital composition to catch up on curriculum. So it doesn't matter if the phone is disrupted, they pick up on what they are behind on in the curriculum at home, or maybe they are smart enough to not be affected by it. Many Danish students on average are less dependent on digital strategies in terms of achieving social success, maybe that is, and recognition, and thus do not respond negatively to not having access to phones in research, because the capital composition helps them to obtain a favorable position in the school social field. So the idea is that maybe students actually possess the social and cultural capital to be able to have a lot of friends in the offline social field in the school. They do not need the digital device as a strategy to obtain friendships and recognition. Though of course they do, but it's not as important to them maybe. That is just a theory. This explanation can be verified when comparing studies on academic performance in a Danish context to other contexts. For instance, a 2017 Danish study found that physical activity has limited to no effect on academic performance, which is opposite to what the vast majority of foreign studies in my literature search found. So schools that enforce a lot of physical activity and stuff like that, it doesn't really have any effect on Danish students. And that's also very interesting because it's opposite to what the vast majority of foreign studies in my literature finds. So it's kind of an indicator that the Danish students are very robust to external factors. The discrepancy between the findings of the English study on phone policies and my findings indicate the research would benefit from zooming out and initiate comparative studies. And this way, one can examine the significance of social stratification and other country-level variables on phone policies, phone use, and phone presence in school. So you could add like another dimension, another level another level in the nested data structure. So you could also investigate countries, for instance. Is it different across countries, how phone policies affect children? And I think that would be a very interesting study to carry out. Yeah, so second, my findings contribute to potential insights throughout the education sector. And that's the blue box you see here. Students in private schools have on average higher socioeconomic status, and students in high schools are older. In fact, students' digital inclusion peaks in high school. However, I have not found the socioeconomic status nor age moderates the correlation between phone policies and students' well-being and academic performance. And if socioeconomic status and age do not matter, then there is a reason to believe that my findings also apply to private schools or high school. But there is one thing here. The phone's functional application is most likely different in high school. Students have chosen an academic path, so there's a selection here, and therefore there is a greater need and incentive for retrieving information online. It would be possible to investigate high school students in a large sample, though, as they also participate in the national well-being assessment and all attend Danish A classes. It is compulsory. And this solves the problem with comparability. However, phone policies of high schools have not been mapped and makes it a lot more labor intensive to carry out a study on this. The third and final contribution is the myth busting of many statements in the societal debate. There is no indication that phone use and presence affect children and adolescents negatively in a Danish school context. The widespread digitization skepticism must be confronted, therefore. And the social sphere and the educational institution and the labor market are becoming increasingly digitalized. And we need to think about how we properly prepare current and future young generations to face the challenges that these changes almost inevitably will entail. We do not promote digital education in primary and lower secondary schools by banning phones. On the contrary, we do the opposite. Although my results indicate that restrictive phone policies are effectless here and now, they might have an effect in the long term. Stigmatizing phones in school do not correspond with the idea of educating new generations for the future. Digital devices and platforms are here to stay, and students have to understand them in order to optimize the use of them. Therefore, in addition to using them in teaching settings, we must educate new generation on the philosophical aspects of digital technology. For instance, the notion of how phones are becoming an extension of oneself and what role big data has in terms of democracy and free will. The point is, the phones are much more than just practical devices that may or may not affect students academically and socially right here and now, depending on what country context, of course. They may also play a part in understanding how the world functions and continuously will function. And I think that schools should embrace digitality and phones and take charge of current and future generations' digital education, just as they already take charge of their mathematical and linguistic education. So this leads me to my final two slides that are the future research slides. And the first research proposal is kind of the cheap one, so to speak. And first, all primary and lower secondary public schools have to be contacted. And information on implemented phone policy and year of implementation has to be obtained. The no screen report by Andreas Liebebrod has already mapped 1/3 of the phone policies, but more than 1,000 schools are yet to be contacted. That is, of course, also labor intensive, but nonetheless possible. The reason why a larger sample is wanted is how it enables you to divide students into more categories without increasing the statistical uncertainty. The result this results in much more detailed models and more complex analysis which increases both the internal and the external validity. So for instance, it is possible that there are specific student cohorts that are not capable of dividing into because of sample size that might be affected by phone policies. And that's why it would be interesting to have an even larger sample. This approach is an extension of my study and clarifies what direction the arrow has between variables of interest. With this design, it is no longer a theoretical assumption that phone policies affect well-being and academic performance. Yet this design is not sufficient if one's goal is to determine whether or not phone policies actually affect well-being and academic performance, hence the causality question mark here. So now we do know when phone policies have been implemented because we have the year of implementation, and therefore we could assume that the arrow is going from phone policy to academic performance because we will be able to investigate and follow a trend over years, so to speak. Yeah, but, and this is the important part, there are still many unobservable variables that can affect well-being and academic performance. And as I showed earlier on, schools with restrictive phone policies perhaps also prefer traditional didactic strategies. Though I managed to control for the potential effect of didactic strategies indirectly by adding a random slope for gender to the model, the risk of phone policy being endogenous, meaning affected by other variables, is still a fact to consider. And therefore you cannot determine whether or not phone policies are the real cause of effects. So for instance, with the didactic strategies here, even though I did control for them, they actually might be the reason why restrictive phone policies, for instance, or other phone policies even cause an effect to academic performance. And therefore, we would need a different design to actually eliminate this possibility. And therefore, the most optimal approach is an experimental design. And this is the expensive one. First, I would recruit primary and lower secondary schools to participate in an experiment. This would result in a 3-level, perhaps even 4-level multi-level analysis. Students nested in classes, nested in schools, yeah, and perhaps even nested in countries. Private schools are also included in the recruitment process, since I would test the students myself and therefore do not rely on data from the national tests or national well-being assessment. And this also includes, also results in that you have more schools to choose from, so to speak. So you would also have a higher possibility of actually be able to recruit a sample size big enough. Secondly, I would instruct schools to implement various phone policies and subject students to surveys and tests in academic performance and personality traits. The fact that I have not identified a correlation between phone policies and students' well-being and academic performance is kind of a blessing in disguise, so to speak. Since no phone policies seem to be better than others, I can ethically justify the assignment of phone policies to schools. So there's no wrong in letting some schools have this phone policies and others have that, because I can argue that none of these phone policies seem to be better or worse. One approach would be a differences in differences design, where one half of the class year group is instructed to allow phone use in the teaching context in form of a teacher-led didactic strategy. So it's not just like a chaotic situation, it's actually going to be used actively in the class, while the other half is instructed to ban phone in the teaching context. Furthermore, one half of all the schools are instructed to allow phone use out of the teaching context, while the other half of the schools are instructed to not allow phone outside the teaching context. So whether or not you have the phone access in recess and so forth. One half schools, that possibility, and the other half of the schools, they are not allowed to have phones. Doing so covers all 4 different constellations of phone exposures, as we see here. So now there's not only free phone policies, there's actually another one, which I have dubbed the didactic phone policy. And this one enables to isolate an academic, isolate the potential academic effect on academic performance, sorry. And here as in my design, you have a potential to isolate the presumed social effect of phone policies. When it comes to variables, I would operationalize the measure of both math and language skills as academic performance, because there are some indication that digital devices and platforms can stimulate different forms of intelligence and skills. An alternative or an additional approach would be to measure students' self-control and use the outcome as a proxy for well-being and academic performance, since higher levels of self-control are linked to both higher levels of well-being and academic performance. I would also survey both students and schools for various informations, such as students' health record to control for mental disorders and illnesses, students' digital behavior, so how much they actually use social media and stuff like that, and schools' economical and educational resources. So, for instance, it's if they have a lot of teachers who have, have an education and not just like substitute teachers, this might have an effect on whether or not it will be a success with this didactic digital strategy. All in all, extending the operationalization of measures for well-being and academic performance, as well as controlling for many more compositional and contextual factors, will strengthen the internal validity. So this will be a very, very powerful design that will, I would say, hard to design it even better. It's also very different from my study and enables to determine causality. Besides being able to test for many more confounding variables and thus further isolate the effects of phone policies, an experimental approach also guarantees the phone policies are exogenous, meaning that they are not affected by other variables. The phone policies are implemented by you as a researcher and are, for instance, not a result of an overall didactic strategy carried out by the school principal. This is the essence of an experimental design, and even though studies in the real world outside the lab never can be 100% certain of causality, it is accepted as causality in the philosophy of social sciences. So that means that for instance, here in this model here, the alternative model, there will be no arrow here. I can actually guarantee that the phone policy is exogenous, that there are no other variables that affect this one because I implemented as a researcher. Yeah. So that is all for this, and thank you for listening. And now I think it's time for questions. If anyone have questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Benjamin. Yeah, so you had a lot of stuff here, and I see that people are still hanging on. So maybe someone has an interesting question. I have some thoughts about kind of future designs and stuff that we might be able to do, but maybe there are also some more practical and down to earth question that has less to do with models and more to do with kind of what can we learn from this in the context of how to do school well for children. So anyone who's interested, I would suggest that you simply turn on your mic and jump in if you have any questions.
That would take as a sign as no one. I went a little bit over time here, so people has probably left the building.
maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So any comments or questions at all, or ideas for where to go from here with this kind of research, maybe from someone else? If not, that's perfectly fine. Okay, so I can just add that maybe one thought I had when you were kind of presenting alternative approaches to investigating this is that what I've learned from working kind of in the educational sciences space for a long time is that getting schools on board with any kind of research is usually tricky and labor intensive on their part. So I would say that one thing that would really be challenging for the last big experimental idea would be to do anything at all that would require a lot of power in terms of many schools implementing new policies or new approaches to doing things. So how many schools would you think you would need in that big kind of 2x2 design that you had at the end?
Yeah, I think it depends on whether or not you will have success with the recruiting the lower grades on a school. Mm-hmm. There could be ethical complications in including younger students in an experimental setup, and it kind of depends on that. What you want is like a substantial sample size. I would say we'll want around 30,000 students. That would be very nice. Of course, that is just wish thinking, but as long as it's more than 1,000 students, then they are distributed, normally distributed. I would say that if you would be able to get around 30 schools, then you would be having a study that is that is a good study. And then you would probably only need maybe 8th or 9th graders. So that would be only the older students. Yeah.
Okay.
But yes.
So that's at least a challenge to consider in anything like this, how to recruit schools and how to get them on.
Yeah.
That's an interesting limitation to consider for the future.
Yeah.
I see people are still hanging on, or maybe they're just gone. Is anyone who came up with questions of their own now while I was?
Maybe I have a question.
Yeah, Martine.
Or suggestion. So I was thinking, if you're not sure how many people you will, or how many observations you will actually need, maybe you could calculate that before collecting the data. I'm not sure how to do it, but I think it's possible to make some kind of calculation based on the number of variables and the model, and how big effect sizes you're looking for, maybe. So yeah, that's just a suggestion.
Yeah, it actually also depends on how many. What can you say? If you're gonna do a split sample and do subgroup analysis, of course you need a bigger sample. But with interaction terms, you would not need a bigger sample because you can just keep the whole sample as one cohort. So the main issue here is with a few amount of schools is that the group level variable, so schools will be smaller. And as I showed earlier on, or told earlier on, simulations show that as long as you have more than 50 schools, there is no, can you say, you shouldn't get misleading results. But even with fewer schools, it's not necessarily given misleading results, and you can actually also control for this in various amounts by looking at different parameters. And so the main issue here is not the sample size of students. I think the main issue is the sample size of schools.
That's what I think too, yeah. Could classrooms be used instead of schools in theory, saying, okay, so in each school there might be 4 8th and 9th grades that could implement different approaches?
Yeah, you could do that actually. That would be like using classrooms as a, you could do that. But the thing is, then the differences design, it kind of, then you would kind of have to limit maybe the study to only look into academic performance, because you can control what happens in a classroom, but outside of the classroom, it's all the students are exposed to the same. So it's kind of, you won't be able to control whether or not they're exposed to one another thing out of the classroom context. Yeah. So yes, it could solve the problem to some extent, but it also creates new problems, or at least you have to limit yourself a little bit extra in the design then. But yeah, that's a good idea to use the classrooms as a level 2, like as a grouping. Then you would probably have 2 to 3 more, 2 to 3 times bigger level 2 sample size, because you have like 2 to 3 grades typically at each school for each, and so forth. So yeah, that makes sense. You could do that.
Any practical questions? So what's your after this? I mean, when I did my study, I was asked, so what's the best model? What should a school do? What's the kind of down to earth practical implication of this? So what would your favorite mobile phone policy be after all of this?
Yeah, my favorite. That's the funny thing is that I had an idea before I wrote my thesis of what my favorite policy was, and then I was very surprised when I was finished, because there is not really any evidence that any phone policy is better than another. But as I also implied, it's only in the short run. I believe that in the long run, it makes sense to let children have access to phones both in and out of context. It's not about whether or not they have access to the phones, it's whether or not they use the phones properly. And I think in schools you should take on this responsibility and educate them. And as the social spheres of offline and online kind of becomes more and more intertwined, it can also be problematic in the long run to eliminate possibilities for some students to even have access to social interactions in school times, because maybe they are more socially vulnerable and need these social online networks as a way to interact socially. And yes, I think that I would suggest to have a liberal phone policy, but as where you would use phones actively in classes, and not as in having no policy in how they use the phone in the classes. And I still think that it should be up to the to the teacher to what degree they use phones in class, because not all the teachers are yet have the capacity to apply didactic digital strategies. But I think they should be educated in this, and also you should put more focus on this in the schools. Like when you educate teachers, like they should learn how to implement digital tools more and more, and also give them the big perspective, like the philosophical aspects of it. What does it mean that phones mean more and more in our lives? And what do you need to keep in mind on, Yeah.
That matches my thinking as well, I think. So I'm glad. Okay, guys, thank you so much for hanging on. I'll just allow a few seconds for anyone to chime in if you've come up with any perspective or questions. Otherwise, we'll just say thank you to Benjamin for sharing his work and being here on this fine, at least in Aarhus, day. Okay, thank you so much, Benjamin. I'll clap for a moment.
Thank you.